Välkomna till arkitekturdagarna och till Sveriges arkitekter på Formdesign Center i Malmö. Vi genomför arkitekturdagarna i samarbete med olika partners. Jag välkomnar nu Malmö universitet, K3 Interaktionsdesign, som ska berätta om olika aspekter av stadsrum, digitalisering och upplevelse. Moderator är Per Linde, lektor på Malmö universitet. Välkommen Per.
Tack. Hi everyone. We will run this session in English because is it very loud? We will run this session in English since we have one English-speaking participant. And as Gunilla said, we're all interaction designers and we deal with different aspects of digital and interactive technologies, which are in all our cases contextualized within the lived environment and also in urban spaces. But we work with a little bit of different different kinds of research. Personally, I am engaged in the research center of Internet and Things and People, which deal with connected devices and how that affect living spaces. And I've been having projects on smart homes. But I'm also the representative of the theme of what is called smart cities. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about, because smart cities and digitalized societies is a very big contemporary research area. And normally one defines smart cities as being applications of a wide range of electronic and digital technologies to communities and cities, and use of internet and communication technologies to transform life and working environments within the region, and embedding such ICTs in also the government systems of cities and regions. So it's very much about a kind of territorialization of practices that brings ICTs and people together. Typical applications areas are around transportation, health, environmental issues, public engagement, and nowadays also with a very strong focus on data and open data, and supporting city services. And architecture and the built environment is part of the smart cities theme. But we have smart here, we have smart there, and it's also a bit of a tiring rhetorics. And if you read smart backwards in Swedish, you get the word trams. And that's actually something that is quite significant for much of the rhetorics around this, but of course there is something in it. And also, this is something that has very much been driven by technology, or by the market, or by the possibilities of technology can do. And we have seen huge amounts of research money being invested in the 80s, for example, looking on Formula One cars races on your mobile phone, which no one wanted to do at that time, or the failed system of WAPs. So there has been lots of failed research. And it turns out that much of the successful research in technology development has also actually been socially driven success stories, such as SMS and email, which were originally invented for quite other purposes than it's used for nowadays. So I think we can also have a alternative definition of what smart cities is, that is something that they are smart enough to connect you directly to your neighbors, that they are built around natural communities and facilitates collective knowledge sharing. So that's a social aspect of smart cities that we can observe is growing more and more today from an origin which had its birth in technology-driven research. And that has actually been a fault, I think, because one starts off with technology, produces data, and then we have new ways of working due to that. But I think that the most successful smart cities nowadays and in the future, they have reversed that order, starting out from ways of working and looking at combining the best aspects of technology infrastructure while making the most of the growing potential of what we call collaborative technologies, how we can use collaboratives in cities together. And in this kind of research, many architects has actually been involved. It's most of the time a very multidisciplinary research. And we can also observe how this research has been informed by the social media patterns that we know today, and that they have created expectations also on connected and augmented homes. So we have models like neighbor communicating to neighbor, patient to patient, family to family. This is something that one is also looking into, not only from an interaction design perspective, but also when we collaborate together with architects. So participation has been a great component in my personal research. And I like to talk about how citizens can be part of making the lived environment and the built environment in cities like active places. And we can observe a concept such as participatory urbanism, which started already around 1900, where some people in Audubon, USA gathered to watch and count birds. And that's a specific kind of producing data. We can see how that data collection has been developed in contemporary cities in terms of using sensor technologies. For example, citizens going around the cities trying to measure the amount of air pollution. And this has also been a very strong potential for people developing apps around this. But I believe very much in involving citizens in the development of cities. Very often, place is the actual starting points. And I will, in this presentation, just briefly introduce some examples of different technologies. We have, for example, Urban Remix, an app where you can make local soundscapes within a specific block or a specific place in the city. And we have apps like the Malmö Stad's Träd app, which maps all the trees in Malmö city and gives information about that. And we have lots of apps in the direction of Fix My Street, where you as a citizen can report an error and directly transmit that to the city government. Very common is also augmented reality applications, which I will not mention at all because Marika will talk about that. But this is something that makes invisible layers of the city potentially visible for people. And trying to animate the environment, to make the environment come alive, that's the ambition of many of these projects. And many of them also explores quite playful ways of doing this, like talking to a lamppost or a waste bin or a construction site, for example. That is one example that is very, as we know, construction sites, they are very dead most of the time. But this is one way of making them speak about what will happen when this is finally built. So it's a lot of apps, but it's not only apps. It's only different kinds of smart objects. We have all seen smart waste bins here around the city. And in other parts of the world, we can see how initiatives on smart lighting is very strong in urban environments and smart sidewalks. And also the form of city trees, which can decrease pollution. I know it's debated, the effectiveness thereof. But the notion of reactive and talking buildings and construction sites is growing very strong. So there are lots of apps, lots of smart objects, but we can also see the architectural solutions coming on more and more. And for example, to the far right, we have a prototype of an Austin-based architectural startup. We had make movable houses that fits into racks like a bottle in a wine rack, or sinks that through sensor technologies disappears into the ordinary surfaces and called upon when needed. And a lot of these projects are future-oriented, but we can also see how one often tries to take care of cultural heritage, such as in this example from China, where they built a futuristic home with these technologies, but very much inspired by the old Futong building. So there's much happening within architecture in the coming years in respect of how one will use these technologies. And one of the things that we already can see, that sustainability is of course a great challenge nowadays, and many houses are built directly for sustainable living lifestyles. And very often they include then the production of alternative energy sources, which will grow extremely much once we have the grid technology for energy in place in Sweden. We are not there yet, but when we can store, exchange and sell energy to our neighbors on a local level, that will be a tremendous opportunity. And that is happening on a small scale already, but will increase immensely, I think. And the whole notion of shared spaces is something that will affect architecture heavily and is already doing so. We are not only building for families anymore. And we all know about gardening initiatives, for example, or waste management, or shared canteens, etc. But I think we can also see these are functionality that we are quite aware of, but we can also see it as houses becoming a kind of maker spaces where you can use the resources and the waste from a specific house or a specific block and then perhaps have a 3D printing environment in the very same house. So residents will also be producers of different kinds of artifacts in the future, to my knowledge at least. And another very big thing is intergenerational living and agile aging, which there are quite many research projects looking upon, especially in Asia, actually, where they have a different view upon keeping family generations together. And something that we have not big experience of now. How will we deal with the data that is produced by these environments and the buildings? I think it will become not only important to have data private and not being able to hack it, but also being able to inspect what kind of data flows are in this building, for example. How can data be materialized? In the picture here up to the right, we can see a house in Malmö which are displaying the energy data from the house, what is produced, what is consumed, etc. And these are very much growing opportunities for service development in living environments. And I have worked extensively in the years, and that's a kind of research strategy to build a common infrastructure and then co-design services on top of that infrastructure together with the people who will use them. So I will summarize a little bit. I think as designers and developers and citizens, we should have a bold imagination of what we can do with technologies and the built environment. I believe strongly in this open infrastructure that people can work upon and not only use as they are designed originally. I believe strongly that we have to take care of the data flows in these environments. And as an implication, a home is no longer a house. A home can be something quite different than four walls and a ceiling. So we have to explore what can this smartness mean. My final image is this one. I couldn't help because I'm always looking into what happened to older technological visions. The mobility picture to the far right is from 1962, where one imagined what could be the future of personal urban mobility. Well, they were not so far away, but we should also always remember that once we propose new solutions, we will always pose new problems as well, just as these vehicles are doing. So that is something that we as designers always have to think about. But that was actually what I wanted to say about this concept of smart cities. So I would like to invite Marika Hedemyr.
Thank you, Per. So, my name is Marika Hedemyr. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Malmö University, and I will share with you today the works that I've been doing, mixed reality walks in public spaces, So I will share with you how I work, some of my methods, then present shortly some other works, and in the end, if you would be involved in one of these projects where you work with these new technologies to activate or present a place, some things to maybe think of. So a little bit of my background. I'm an artist by training, choreographer, so I work in between choreography and public art. And in almost all of the works I've created, it is about the emotional and the political relation between people and places. And the work I've been doing has been described as magic realism in public spaces. So what I do now the last years, I do these mixed reality walks where I use smartphones and headphones for the audience to explore a place. And what I'm actually exploring in my research and in my practice is how can I create performative art without performers, that you get a sense of liveness and performativity in the work. So technically, I combine these augmented reality and mixed reality technologies that are available through our smartphones with the theatrical contract. And the theatrical contract is when we kind of play together. If I say, oh, we just landed on the moon. Can you hear the silence? Do you see the things over there? Let's go. And we sit in the room and we kind of imagine together. That is what you do when you go to a theater. So how these techniques from the performing art for imagination can be combined with these new technologies. Are you by the tree? You are standing at Korsvägen, right in the middle of a crossroad and a bus and a tram stop. Have you been here before? Every day, 30,000 persons pass here. There are choices of direction to make, so get ready. Who will you become? Where are you going? Here at the crossroad, we are separated and together at the same time. How do you relate to the one next to you? Your choice of direction is turning the world. So this work is created for Korsvägen in Göteborg, and the works are really site-specific. So when I work with this technology, I combine the available, let's go to, and here we have an extra thing. How many of you know what is augmented reality? Yeah, a few. So it can be described as, thank you very much, it's like you have the reality and then you have a digital layer of data on top of it, and that digital layer, Pokemon Go is maybe something you've experienced or seen, that has to be connected in the right time and the right space. For example, this bird can only be seen there. We also have Snapchat filters. We have also artists exploring this. So there's a lot of things so they're really site-specific and time-specific when you do this. The way I work with it is I use the smartphones and the layering of you having one view of a place presented through the screen and the one that you can see with your eyes and experience at the location. So with it, you have a double layer of a place where you can play with a lot of things and create your own image of the place in your experience of these double layers. And a little bit about how I work. I often work with archival material or documentary material. And one way is to see it as a repertoire. So I often include the body, because something about how does it smell, how does it shake, do you feel the wind here, you know, what's going on in this place. Combined also with a loop about the socio-economic situation and power structure about the place. But then also about past, present, and future, because when you're standing at a place with have a lot of history or maybe a lot of changes going on for the future, you can like get all these layers at the same time, so you get this sensation of standing in the middle of everything. So how I go about? I spend a lot of time on the locations, walk and talk to the expert, the people living there, the people working there. And often when you come to a place, you start to feel, okay, what are the themes and stories that maybe could be told at this place? Then, of course, it's a question of testing things out, making choices of which media. And the thing that I'm working is this triangulation or double exposure of your bodily sensation of the place, what you can see and hear through the application, and what is around you, the people around you, and everything. So we have the work at Korsvägen, and I do not create these things by myself. I have a close collaboration with RISE Interactive, the research institute, the Gothenburg studio. And the Korsvägen work was created for Art Biennial. And it was about an immigrant and emigrant's journey, where I was collecting text from how Göteborg is marketed today as a destination for tourists and businesses, but also about when Swedes emigrated to America. And it had branching narratives, and you can make choices when you walk. It all stayed at Korsvägen, the junction. Maybe some of you have been there in Göteborg. And the last two works I've done, it's been done for Mölndals Stadsmuseum, a local museum in Mölndal next to Göteborg. And as you can see here, this is a place where they have a waterfall, so they were really early in the industrialization process. And the museum wanted to do, how can we activate or do something that are with places in our commune, not only presenting places and history inside the museum building. So they wanted to continue and try, how can we do this with the new technology? So the first one was in Kvarnbyn, the place where the waterfall. Has anyone been there? Some of you? I mean, it's an amazing place to be. So it's an app, and it was opened last year, and now these works are part of the permanent exhibitions of the museum. Here we used, again, smartphone. This time we used panoramas. So you had 4 different locations where you have this technology, and on this panorama you have small windows that you can click on. So you walk around, so in a sense it is an individual experience with that, where you see one thing in the phone and the other, and you're guided from one place to another, where we have these images, where you have this location pin as a sculpture, because it was important for me that you can meet the place on eye level, not from above on a map where you click, which is a common feature in these digital things, but actually that you meet it on a scale 1 to 1. So there's also a lot of changes going on. Factories, industry is gone, 4,000 new flats are built, so while we were working, things were changing. Here is one example of these windows. You get to enter into a small flat, you go to the market. I work with 3D sound, binaural sound, and basically it's small films with 3D sound that you get when you click on it. So that's the technology we've used. So the thing is that through micro stories, you can tell a larger stories. That's the structure we're using. And this one you can actually download or do via the web, and you don't have to be on location because it's not locked. So the other work is a place at Tulebosjön, also in Mölndal. This is a place with a small lake and a ridge where they found hundreds and hundreds of cooking pits from the Bronze Age. And cooking pits look like this. No one has lived here. It looks like they have been used for ritualistic or parties. We don't know, actually, but it was not people cooking food unless it was for a party, but they were not living there. So it's like a spectacular panorama, and also the ridge where they stay is part of the path that goes between Oslo and Copenhagen and has been like a travel trail in the Bronze Age and even before. So the museum wanted to do something, and as you can see here, nothing can be seen on the slope. On the top there are houses built. And so they wanted, how can we create a virtual museum there? So what we did was that we kind of created 8 virtual rooms. This one is for children, and it's also much more using the 3D models. Here the location pin became a sculpture, so where you get into the room by jumping through the hole with your phone, or you can just tap on it. And then inside you get different models. One example is you get a cooking pit and explaining like what is it, what was it used for, and that we actually don't know what it was used for. Another model is a timeline to get a sense of how far away is the Bronze Age and where are we today. So this, like when you have it on your phone, you can walk along like it's 100 meters laid out and you can go along it, replacing the sky with stars. So just to like give you some things, if you would be involved working with a team or an artist, some important questions that I come across when doing this, both as commission but also smaller projects with my initiative. What is the purpose of new technology? What can this technology do that we can't do with something else? Really to have that, because then you might find, well, we actually want it because of something. Is it site-specific? Can it only be experienced in that specific place, or do you want to be able to move an experience? So make choices about that in the work. And for which bodies is it created? For the thing with the cooking pits by the lake, you have to be able to walk, listen to things and hold a smartphone, be able to do. So it requires this, certain bodies can do that, certain cannot. So that is also choices to be made of when you want to do. And one thing is, do you want the place to be activated or to be presented? Here, both me and the museum really wanted to activate the place, but often museums present place. You present it with traditional information about the place, but that can also inform like decision you make about it. And then also to think of the politics of interpretation. Also, as Per said, this technology in the smartphone and augmented reality comes a lot from the military industry. And it's a lot of splash, boom, bang. But it's like with letters. You can write love letters and you can write hate letters. So this technology, it doesn't have to be running and shooting and splash, boom, bang aesthetics. You can do different things, but you just have to think that a lot of this technology is to be like flashy and nice. And if you want that, maybe if you want something else, you have to work on it. And also what values is based on, if you have a narrator, who is this narrator, whose voice is actually telling the stories of these places. And with the museum, they were really keen on telling the untold stories about the place with the waterfall. The common story is about the men who ran the factories, but there are actually a lot of stories to tell about that place. So that was intentionally telling all these other stories about a place. Facts and fiction, and how you do the thing. So this was it, my presentation, and now I would like to hand over to Simon, who has another take on this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marika. My name is Simon Niedenthal. I'm a researcher at K3 Malmö University in the area of olfactory interaction. And when Per asked me to be on this panel, I started to think, what is it that I could bring to this discussion to present to architects? What is it that architects need to think about scent and olfaction, or why do they need to think about them? There's a lot of reasons. First of all architectural spaces, no architectural spaces are neutral from an olfactory standpoint. Our space here is scented by ancient beams and some of the other things that create this environment. But the more I look at olfaction, the more I think that what I can bring to you is just generally the argument that olfaction is the great undiscovered country of the senses. And as someone who works in designing for olfactory experience, I'm constantly being overtaken by new research results. And this is a really boring slide to show you, but this was just published a couple weeks ago by researchers from SLU up north. And basically, they're doing a study of what is the way in which psychological stress is relieved. And they want to see how does each sense contribute to that relief. And I just want to read their final conclusion here. The result indicates that olfactory stimuli may be better at facilitating stress reduction than visual stimuli. Currently, urban planners prioritize visual stimuli when planning open green spaces, but urban planners should also consider multisensory qualities. So I think that's a really interesting point to bring forward, and I thought I would try to replicate this experiment with you by bringing some things for you to smell. So I have two materials. The first is, this is designed to represent air pollution. You may smell and pass back. Smells great, huh? This will stress you out. Smell it and pass it back. And we have also the second material is called geosmin, which is the scent that is exhaled by soil microorganisms in the rain. So like what we're getting outside. So this will helpfully relieve some of the stress you've just experienced by smelling the air pollution. So anyway, this is the consequences of scent and of our ability to smell, I think make it particularly interesting and also challenging for those of us working in olfactory design. I did my PhD in the area of, I come from a long background of working in media, specifically working with and teaching lighting and working with light as a material. And it's one thing that I've noticed that architects are quite good at, which is to think in light. Just to take an example from Louis Kahn. I think architects really have a deep understanding of how light defines form and space, and also some of the non-visual effects of light upon emotion and behavior. I think those are all super interesting and important. One thing I have learned too is that light is relatively easy to think in because it is extremely regular. It's very fast. It obeys specific physical laws. These can be used to calculate digital simulations very easily, so it's really possible to simulate light pretty well. It's much more difficult to think in smell. Smell looks more like this. It's slow, it's turbulent, it's unpredictable, and difficult to contain and control. So it's particularly interesting. I mean, we can say things about it. It's not completely chaotic. We can draw upon fluid mechanics and some other sciences to understand smell better and how it functions. We can see there's a lot of these. It's made up of a series of eddies and turbulence patterns that really are based on airflow and how air is moving in a space. So it's affected by things like ventilation systems. But this is a really interesting thing to try to grasp, and this is the sort of thing that I struggle with quite a bit as a researcher. One of the things I'm looking at quite a bit is, as a researcher, and which is also a meaningful concept for architects, is the notion of a smellscape. Smellscape, this comes from John Porteous, who is coming from geography and physical geography studies. But it points out some of the differences that I've tried to highlight between light and how smell functions. So a smellscape, we can start to talk about that, is basically a landscape of smell ambience that is non-continuous, fragmentary in space, and episodic in time. And again, very different from the way that light functions. So there's a couple ways in which people in my area, people who are interested in scent and olfaction, how it works, try to understand smellscapes. And there's some really interesting artistic practices in this area. One of them, maybe some of you were present, Kate McLean, an artist whose practice is basically to create very beautiful and elaborate smell maps of different cities. So she was present and did a smell walk in Linde in May. And this is basically a process of a group of volunteers or people who are interested going through the city, basically exploring the olfactory qualities of different parts of the city, different surfaces, all different kinds, not just positive, but also aversive kinds of smells. Noting them, mapping them over time, associating them with what's their source is. And she creates really beautiful and sometimes animated smell maps of cities. How does scent function in a city given the particular texture of that cityscape? So she did this. This is actually animated. It doesn't show very well, but it's and it's not animated here. But basically, it's you can see it on her website. And this is basically Amsterdam. So this is animated over time with different scents noted in terms of their intensity and their source, whether they're sort of organic or whether they're man-made, synthetic. And it's quite a beautiful way of thinking about how scent functions in the city space. So that's one way of learning about smellscapes, is to simply map them, see what's out there, go explore them, discover them. But then many of us are interested also in designing smellscapes. And there's lots of course, different practices in which scent is designed for some particular purpose in a space. And so obviously gardens are one example, but there's also more dynamic and different kinds of spaces that have scent designed into them. And so as an interaction design researcher, I'm also interested in the concept of digital olfaction, which is actually a thing. Basically, when we talk about digital olfaction, we're not talking about digitizing scent materials. Just like with the materials I sent around to you, we're always working with physical materials. We can't synthesize scents out of nothing like we can pixels of light and color. So we're always working with materials. But basically, digital olfaction is to integrate scent materials into an interactive system of some kind. And there's different ways we can think about this as well in terms of input and output to the system. So for example, digital olfaction often is dealing with electronic noses, for example, that are sensors that respond to specific molecules. And there's electronic noses in this room. There's one right here. I think that's one, or maybe that's maybe a speaker. But a smoke detector, for example, is an electronic nose. It simply responds to a single molecule. Once there's some sort of scent that has been sensed, then we oftentimes think about encoding and transmitting olfactory information, decoding it, and then displaying it. And an olfactory display is basically, it's like a visual display, except basically instead of outputting visual, pictures or images, an olfactory display outputs scent. So this is basically what happens with an olfactory display. We have some sort of physical odor material, always in the physical world when it comes to scent. There's some kind of way in which it is vaporized or brought into the air, and then it's delivered in some way to the nose. Very simple, straightforward, but always challenging to deal with in reality. So as someone who is designing this, and this is also true for anyone who wants to design any kind of olfactory experience in real space, there's a couple of different considerations that I've learned through bitter experience. Controlling the space of scent interaction. So this is a really interesting question, and it's also relevant for anyone designing space. But it's challenging. I mean, it's possible to define lighting in a space. You can, as an architect or lighting designer, you can run a simulation of your space and see exactly how your space is going to look under a particular lighting. It's much more difficult to work with scent in this way. Scent is slow, it's persistent, it's difficult to contain, it's hard to predict, it's very much related to airflow. There's a long history of scented media and scent technologies that have failed. So it's long, if you've heard of smell-o-vision or any of the experiments from film and motion pictures in the 1950s, those were a big bust. But over time, there's been a lot of incremental improvements, and people think about designing for smell interaction in terms of the space in a couple of ways I think are really interesting. The first is the close to the body experience of scent is possible to design for. And this is a picture of the Sony Aroma Stick, which is a personal fragrance device. They describe it as, this is marketed in Japan. It's described as the Walkman of scent, which I think is a great concept. But a lot of times when people are designing for the space of the body, for a scent experience in that space, they're drawing upon different kinds of metaphors. One of them is like, how do people, there's a long history of people holding things and smelling them, but one way that people talk about it is like bending in to sniff a flower. So there's a lot of ways in which designers can draw upon these particular kinds of behaviors. Intermediate space is interesting. How do we control scent in intermediate space? It seems like it's just going to go anywhere that the air blows it. There are ways in which you can control scent in intermediate space. I love this research, which is done in Japan. These are toroidal vortices shot by a vortex cannon. A toroidal vortex is basically a spinning donut, or it's like a smoke ring. So those of you who've blown a smoke ring have created toroidal vortices. So it's basically a toroid that has internal spinning and turbulence. And this allows you to project scent or anything you want, or smoke, very precisely to a particular place. So there's a lot of people working with these vortex cannons with things like different technologies that track the nose, for example. Fascinating. I love this stuff. Larger spaces. So this is trying to think about control of larger space, scent in larger spaces. And there's been a lot of experiments with this over time, going way back to the beginning of the 20th century, where people, again, would work with just basically ventilation systems. How do we think about, it's very crude. If you just put scent into a ventilation system, it's going to, well, it's really hard to know where it's going to go. It's going to persist. It's going to build up. There's all sorts of problems. This is a really interesting project done by an Austrian artist named Wolfgang Georgsdorf, who created this device installation called Center 2.0. It has 72 different scents, computer-driven. It basically, he creates this space out of ripstop nylon, which is very precisely specified to have a particular permeability by air. And at the very back of the space, there's a powerful and completely silent fan that extracts the air from the space. So what happens is the scents are coming into the space from that giant, crazy sci-fi like looking thing, very controlled, and then they're slowly moving through the space. And so it's possible for every scent, instead of blending together, every scent has a beginning, middle, and end, which is super interesting. So it's very he's very obsessive. He knows a lot about the physics of how to control this, and it works. You can have a really interesting scent experience there. So what we do, I've tried to learn from all these examples, how do people think about dealing with the difficulties of the material of scent. And one thing that we do as our research, and I'm going to present my project, sort of like Marika did hers, is we do smell training through VR games. So I'm working with researchers at Stockholm University in the area of olfactory psychology, and we are interested in seeing how people, if there are particular benefits for people training their sense of smell. And we see games as being motivational. And we're interested in working with VR because we're interested in different kinds of spatial hypotheses related to memory. I think a lot of people have kind of an intuitive understanding that scent oftentimes has something to do with memory. So, and we're looking to do produce different kinds of empirical results with this. So olfactory training is generally, and the idea here is that if you practice smelling things, if you smell those little strips I gave you regularly over time, you get better at distinguishing one from another. You can identify them better. You can distinguish them at lower concentrations when they're fainter. But that this is an interesting thing to look at, because one thing that's been demonstrated is that if you are better at smelling things, there's a knockoff kind of effect upon your memory. So we're interested in seeing whether it's possible to help people in terms of their cognitive abilities through training to be able to smell better. And this is an interesting one. I think, again, people intuitively know that smell has something to do with memory. It evokes memories really quickly. It's the first sense to disappear in cases of dementia. So there's some interesting connection there. So our idea is, can we intervene in these situations in some way? And by training people to smell better, can we demonstrate some kind of cognitive benefit? So, and we're working with digital games because they have a particular kind of power. They're considered to be motivating. They're an interesting cultural form. And there's all sorts of benefits with working. It's a very long slide here, but we see certain benefits with being able to work with games, and also being able to work in a digital environment that allows us to capture different kinds of feedback on how people engage with smell. So we're working with different kinds of spatial hypotheses when we're looking at smell. We look at, there's some again, this stuff, the research is really new. So it's always out there and being put out there really recently. It just came out last year. Some research suggesting that olfaction evolved to help us wayfind, to aid navigation in some way. And so again, we're really interested in looking at, in this case, spatial memory and in relation to scent. And so we've developed the infrastructure to make this happen. So one thing we're doing these are my collaborators in Stockholm. That's me with the device. That's an olfactory display. It outputs scent. It's built into the controller of an HTC Vive VR system, and it looks kind of like this. This is basically a device that when I click on something, I can pull an object in a virtual space to my nose, and when it gets close enough, it'll output a scent. So it feels like I'm smelling a virtual object, which is a really powerful kind of illusion. This is kind of what it looks like. It's really simple, 3D printing, working with microcontrollers. We develop scent characters and scent art assets for exploring scent. These are more aimed at children and more playful kind of qualities. And this is another environment we've been working at. So when we design environments, they look kind of like this. They're kind of, again, they're participating in a kind of aesthetic of many sort of digital games have. But the idea here is that as you go through this space as part of a VR simulation, you can pick up flowers in different places, smell them, and then you have to go back and replace the flowers later and remember where you were when you smelled it. So there's a kind of a spatial memory challenge with that. that's the work we do. I'm representing Nosewise, which is a group of researchers here and in Stockholm. And I don't think that I'm not going to have a chance for questions, but I'll just show my cool Mario slide here. So anyway, thank you very much. And I'll turn the microphone back to Per.
Okay, thank you. We will have time just for a very brief discussion. So if Marika and Simon would like to come up here and stand like a very small triangle here. And if I can ask Gunilla to wave at me when we have 1 minute left, perhaps, because we are a bit short of time. And this was not the questions I had. Actually, they are gone. But nevertheless, I think that we are all working with extremely new technologies, and we have all touched upon the dangers of letting the technology drive the development. I wonder, how have the two of you tackled? How can we find a balance of having the human at the center while still exploring new technologies? What are your take on that?
Well, I think one example for me, when I started to work with augmented reality, and I was explaining to people going around to technical sites, people say, "Oh, that's great! And when you can come close, you can start to shoot each other." And I was doing a work about empathy, so that's like, no, not. So then it's like, you really have to know, what do you want to do with the technology? What do you want to fill it in with? What do you want to use it with? And by starting in that end, then you can say, okay, which technology would be appropriate, but not to downplay the force of the military industry or the technology industry, where there's a lot of money and they want to make profit. So of course, they forward a certain agenda. But I think it has to do about finding the pockets, but also showing good examples of how could you use these technologies in other ways.
I think that's a good answer, and I always thinking about my own research as trying to, because it's very rare that we invent new technologies ourselves. So mostly my strategy has been to redirect the force of the originally consuming or military technologies. For you, Simon, you seem to have started working the other way around, working with sense and olfactory challenges as they are, and these technologies are also brand new. Right. Does that change the older working only with sense?
Well, there is actually a military connection here, because the military is very interested in electronic noses, mostly for explosives detection and some other things. But what we're doing is very much driven by the sort of looking at specific hypotheses we're trying to work with. So, and we're not necessarily only working with technologies. I mean, some of the research experiments we do just involve simple canisters of flavored black tea. So, I mean, we work with things that are very low tech as well. So we basically choose technologies simply because they're of interest to explore specific hypotheses. We're interested in VR because we're interested in some spatial things that we want to be able to control in some way and have as part of a digital system so we can capture behavior. That's not to say that we couldn't be more reflective, but the fact is that's sort of how we're going. And so we're just sort of struggling with hardware development and game development along those lines. And it's a little bit frustrating sometimes.
Yeah. We have actually already spent our time, so we had the ambition to have a more lengthy discussion here, but that happens with us academics. We like to talk about our work.
Yeah.
So a final question. Simon, what is the smelliest city you have ever visited?
Oh, I say this in a positive way because I love it, is Bangalore, for sure, in India. There's just, maybe it's just because the smells are more novel to me, but I love it, for sure.
Okay.
So,
and we're all based here at the Malmö University, here in Malmö, if you would like to get in contact with us.
Yes.
So we're here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.